Spring, 1220. In a water meadow south of Old Sarum in the county of Wiltshire, a bishop named Richard Poor kneels in the wet grass and lays a single block of limestone into a shallow trench. The trench is barely 4 feet, 1.2 metres, deep. The ground under it is saturated gravel and chalk sitting directly on the water table. Every experienced mason for miles around tells him the same thing. This is not ground you build a cathedral on. On April 28, 1220, Richard Poor does it anyway. The cathedral he starts that morning is still standing today. Salisbury Cathedral has not shifted in 806 years. Its central tower and spire, added a century later, rise 404 feet, 123 metres, into the sky, and weigh thousands of tons more than the original foundation was ever meant to carry. And Salisbury is not the only one. Durham Cathedral has stood since 1093. Winchester Cathedral held its ground for 827 years on a raft of diagonally stacked beech trunks laid over peat bog. Chartres rose from its own ashes after the 1194 fire and has not been rebuilt since. The modern reinforced concrete church down your street is designed to last 50 years. Today, we're going to show you why the medieval version outlasts it by a factor of 20. The foundations that only worked because they could never dry, the arches that redirected gravity itself, the geometry that laid out cathedrals without a single ruler, and the guild that disappeared the moment a king dissolved the monasteries that fed it. Salisbury is not the oldest stone church in Europe. It is not the largest. It is not the most famous, but it is the most revealing because it sits on ground that should have collapsed under its own weight inside a century. A cathedral built on a swamp, with a foundation 4 feet deep, carrying the tallest medieval spire in the British Isles. And the building has not moved. The secret is not one technique, it is a system. 5 interlocking disciplines that every major church builder from 1050 to 1500 had to master before he was allowed to lay a single block. Remove one and the building collapses. Combine all 5 and you get a structure that stands through invasions, earthquakes, fires, plagues, and the entire Industrial Revolution without being rebuilt. Let's start with the ground, because most people think a medieval cathedral sits on a deep pit of stone and concrete, and that is wrong. Salisbury Cathedral, one of the largest stone churches in England, rests on a chalk raft only 4 feet, 1.2 metres, deep. Winchester Cathedral, begun in 1079, was raised over peat bog on a 15-inch, 38-centimetre platform of beech trunks laid diagonally across each other and pressed into the saturated ground. Venice drove somewhere between 8 and 16 million wooden piles, mostly larch, oak, alder and elm, each only 4 to 10 inches, 100 to 250 millimetres, across and 3 to 11 feet, 1 to 3.5 metres, long, into its lagoon bed across 1,600 years. These foundations should not last. Wood in contact with water is supposed to rot, and yet they are the longest-lived load-bearing elements in European architecture. The reason is a paradox modern construction has never replicated. Wood decay needs 3 things to happen at once: moisture, oxygen, and microorganisms that can digest cellulose. Submerge a timber pile below the water table in wet clay or peat, and the second ingredient disappears. A 2016 study published in Construction and Building Materials analysed woodpile samples from Venice's foundations and found that oxygen in the saturated lagoon sediment falls essentially to 0. Every rot fungus and aerobic bacterium that would normally eat the pile is starved. What remains is a single slow degradation pathway, anaerobic erosion bacteria that attack the outer cell walls at a rate so gradual that medieval piles show bacterial damage in only the outermost half-inch to inch, 1 to 3 centimetres, after 7 centuries underground. A 2021 study by Charlotte Bjørdahl at the University of Gothenburg examined 9 spruce and pine foundation piles from Gothenburg's historic city centre and found that decay was limited to the outer surface of the wood. The cores inside had stayed structurally sound for more than 400 years. Medieval builders did not understand anaerobic microbiology, but they understood what they saw. Foundation timber placed permanently below the water table did not fail in any human lifetime, so they built on top of wet ground and never let the wood dry out. When the water table dropped at Winchester in the 19th century and air reached the medieval raft for the first time, the timber began failing within decades. Between 1906 and 1911, a diver named William Walker spent 6 hours a day underwater, placing 25,800 bags of concrete, 114,900 concrete blocks, and 900,000 bricks under the cathedral to save it. The beach raft had worked for 827 years. The moment it was exposed to oxygen, it had about 50 left. But even the best foundation collapses if the walls above it try to push themselves apart. The second piece of the system is where medieval engineering shifts from material science to applied physics. A round Roman arch transmits its load in 2 directions. Most of the weight presses straight down into the piers. A significant portion pushes sideways at the springing, the point where the arch meets the wall. The thrust angle is around 45 degrees. That lateral force has to go somewhere, which is why early medieval churches have walls so thick and windows so small. The walls were fighting the arch. Then someone at Durham Cathedral, between 1093 and 1133, pointed the arch. By meeting 2 arcs at a central angle above the springing line rather than curving continuously, a pointed arch steepens the resultant thrust vector. More of the load now travels straight down into the piers. Less tries to push the walls outward. The same building could have thinner walls and larger windows without collapsing. The ribbed vault came next. Instead of a continuous stone dome pressing down uniformly on every inch of the wall beneath it, stone ribs arch from pier to pier at the groins where vault surfaces meet. These ribs carry the weight. The thin stone webbing between them carries only itself. A ribbed vault concentrates load at 4 points instead of spreading it across the wall. That concentration freed the wall sections between the piers to become something no previous builder had been able to use. A structural non-element. Glass. The stained glass windows of Chartres, Amiens, and Reims are possible because the wall no longer has to hold up the roof. The final element of the load system is the one a tourist can see from outside. The flying buttress. Even with a pointed arch and a ribbed vault, a small residual horizontal force still pushes outward at the vault springing. A flyer, an arched stone strut, angled between 45 and 60 degrees from horizontal, catches that force at the exact point where it leaves the building and redirects it along its length toward a massive external pier. The external pier is weighted at the top with a stone pinnacle. Adding vertical load steepens the force vector and drives the combined thrust straight into the ground. At Amiens Cathedral, begun in 1220, each bay's flying buttresses catch the lateral force that would otherwise tear the nave walls open and drive it outward into the external piers. A structural thrust line analysis published by the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid in 2020 mapped the full load path through nave, piers, flyers and buttresses into the foundations. Every stone is doing a specific job. Remove any of the 3 and the others fail. Durham had been experimenting with pointed ribbed vaults for almost 50 years before the full system came together. The choir of the Basilica of Saint Denis, rebuilt under Abbot Suger between 1140 and 1144, was the first building to unite the pointed arch and the ribbed vault in a fully Gothic logic. Flying buttresses came shortly after, and by the time Chartres burned in 1194 and rose again as pure Gothic, every major cathedral in northern France was copying the approach. Reims began in 1211, Amiens in 1220. But none of it could have been built without the third piece of the system, Geometry. Medieval Europe did not have a standardized unit of measurement that crossed borders. The foot in Paris was different from the foot in London, the EL in Strasbourg different from the ELL in Vienna. And yet cathedrals built 500 miles, 800 kilometers apart share exact proportional relationships. The method was not arithmetic, it was geometric. A master mason laid out a ground plan with a rope, a peg, and a pair of compasses. He started with a base square, ad quadratum. To generate the next proportional module, he rotated that square 45 degrees and inscribed a new square whose sides ran through the midpoints of the first. The ratio between those two squares is 1 to the square root of 2. Stack that module up the cathedral's elevation, and the whole building emerges from pure geometry without anyone measuring a specific length. A second system worked from the equilateral triangle, ad triangulum. Its side-to-height ratio is 1 to the square root of 3 divided by 2. In 1391, the Lombard masters laying out Milan Cathedral realized that their ad quadratum ground plan would produce an incommensurable height ad triangulum. They summoned a mathematician from Piacenza, Gabriele Stornaloco. His written opinion, delivered on October 13, 1391, rounded the theoretical height of 83.138 units to 84 units, so it could be divided cleanly into 6 modules of 14. The compromise is still legible in the cathedral today. A 2016 article by Sebregondi and Schofield in Cambridge's Architectural History Journal documents this expertise as the earliest surviving record of medieval proportional design being negotiated on the work site. The theory was not a metaphor. It was how the building got laid out. The sketchbook of Villard de Honnecourt, drawn between 1225 and 1235 and preserved in the French National Library, shows the method in practice. Villard drew rose windows, vaults, tower elevations, and wall sections using compass and straight edge alone. 6 of his surviving pages document Reims Cathedral. His instructions for squaring a circle, for transferring a full-size vault profile to a small parchment sketch, for deriving a window's proportions from a generating polygon. All of it is geometric construction without a single number. The cathedral was built by drawing, not by measuring. Those drawings became templates, the 4th piece of the system. Each major element of a cathedral, every arch, every mullion, every vault rib, was drawn to full scale on a tracing floor laid with soft plaster. The York Minster tracing floor still survives. From those full-scale drawings, wooden templates were cut. The templates went to the banker mason's workshop, where he cut each stone to fit its template exactly. Stones arrived at the scaffold pre-fitted. Nobody measured them against each other on the building. A stone cut on the ground to a template drawn from a geometric proportion laid down by rope and compass. That is why the joints on surviving Gothic masonry are so tight. Every block was a piece of a puzzle whose shape had been settled before any of it was lifted. Each banker mason cut his personal mark into every stone he shaped. A 1306 contract between Richard of Stowe and the Dean and chapter of Lincoln Cathedral lays out the system in primary detail. Plain walling stones were paid by measured length, identified by the mason's mark. A University of Warwick research project has documented thousands of these marks on surviving English cathedrals. The mark was a quality control signature and an accounting record. If a stone failed, the guild knew whose work it was. The mason's reputation, and often his livelihood, was carved into the wall he helped raise. Compare that to a modern concrete pour, where no individual is accountable for any specific cubic yard once the truck has left the site. All of it was held together by one institution, the 5th piece of the system, and the one modern construction has no equivalent for: the medieval Stoneworkers' Guild. Each major cathedral had a permanent lodge, a Bauhütte, attached to it. Apprentices entered at around 14 years old. They served 5 years under a master, then a mandatory wanderjahr, a full year travelling between lodges to learn regional techniques, before they could be promoted to foreman. On April 25, 1459, 17 cathedral master builders from lodges across the empire, Strasbourg, Vienna, Basel, Cologne, and 13 others, met at Regensburg to sign the ordinances that codified the whole system. Jobst Dotzinger, master of the Strasbourg Lodge, led the Congress. Those ordinances are the earliest surviving written training standard for the craft. They were revised and re-signed at Strasbourg in 1563. By that point, the craft had less than a century to live. Because in 1517, Martin Luther had nailed 95 theses to a different church door, and by the 1530s, the monasteries and cathedral chapters that had paid the lodges for 4 centuries were being dissolved across northern Europe. Henry VIII dissolved the English monasteries between 1536 and 1541. Cathedral fabric funds, pilgrim income, indulgence revenue, all of it evaporated. The lodges emptied. Apprentices had no masters to learn from. Masters had no commissions to train on. The continuous chain of technique, passed mouth to mouth on scaffolds for 400 years, was broken in one generation. The English Civil War, from 1642 to 1651, finished what the Reformation had started. By the late 17th century, what had been working cathedral lodges across Europe had become something else. Social fraternities, speculative Freemasonry, memory of a craft that no longer built anything. The replacement showed up in 1824 when Joseph Aspdin patented Portland cement in Leeds. Within a century, reinforced concrete had taken over every major construction project in the West. A Portland cement pour sets in hours, not years. Reinforced concrete buildings are designed for a working life of 50 years. Bridges are designed for 100. A University of New South Wales article published in 2016 concluded that more than 80% of structural damage in reinforced concrete comes from one mechanism: steel rebar corrosion. Water reaches the steel rusts. Rust occupies more volume than the steel it replaced. The reinforcement splits the concrete from the inside. The material that was supposed to make the building strong is the material destroying it. The Crystal Cathedral in Garden Grove, California, completed in 1980, designed by Philip Johnson, covered in over 10,000 glass panes, required a major renovation by the 2010s. The sealant had failed. The roof leaked. The seismic retrofit was overdue. It had made it 30 years. Salisbury Cathedral, by contrast, has not moved in 800. What medieval masons built was not primitive. It was a chain. 5 independent disciplines locked into a single system where every element reinforced the others. Foundations that lasted because they were always wet. Arches that redirected gravity into straight vertical columns. Windows made possible because walls no longer carried the roof. Geometry that could lay out a cathedral without a single measurement. Templates that pre-fitted every stone before any of them was raised. Guild training that passed the whole system from hand to hand for 400 years until the Reformation cut the chain in half. Modern architecture has none of those things. It has cement engineered to fail inside a single human lifetime. It has rebar that destroys itself from the inside. It has buildings designed by software running calculations no single human on the site understands, built by crews that will never see each other again, funded by investors who plan to sell the property before the first crack appears. The medieval church was built by men who expected their sons to worship in it. The modern building is built by a corporation that expects to be out of the liability window before the warranty expires. Salisbury still stands because a crew in 1220 treated every step. The trench scooped only as deep as the wet ground demanded. The stones cut on the ground before any were lifted. The geometry drawn with a rope and a pair of compasses in a field outside the meadow, as part of one continuous decision. They did not understand anaerobic microbiology. They did not understand thrust vectors. They did not know what quicklime chemistry actually did. But they knew what worked, and they passed that knowledge on without letting go of any of it for 500 years. 2,000 years ago, blacksmiths in southern India made a steel so advanced that when scientists finally put it under an electron microscope in 2006, they found carbon nanotubes inside it. One of the strongest materials ever measured were created 20 centuries before anyone knew atoms existed. This steel was harder than anything Europe could produce, yet it bent without breaking. Blades forged from it could slice a silk scarf in mid-air. And when Alexander the Great arrived in India in 326 BC, the gift he valued above gold and jewels was 2.5 tons of this metal. By 1800, the technique for making it had completely vanished. For the next 200 years, it defeated every scientist who tried to crack it, including Michael Faraday, 300 experiments at the Paris Mint, and a metallurgist who spent 20 years of his career on nothing else before he finally found the answer hiding in an impurity so small that nobody had thought to measure it. This is the story of Wootz steel, how it was made in sealed clay crucibles over 2,000 years ago, what modern science has found hidden inside its structure at the nanometer scale, and why, despite every tool available to 21st century metallurgy, we have never fully replicated the original process. What it actually was. Europeans called it Damascus steel, but that name is misleading because Damascus never produced a single gram of it. Every ingot came from southern India, from regions like Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Telangana, where craftsmen had been making this metal since at least the 3rd century BC. Europeans simply called it Wootz, a corruption of uku, the South Indian word for steel. If you held a Wootz ingot in your hand, it would feel like a small, dense cake of metal, roughly the size and shape of a hockey puck, weighing between 0.5 kilogram and 2 kilograms. If you were to cut one in half, it would reveal a distinctive branching pattern frozen in place from when the molten steel solidified. Here is what made Wootz different from every other steel on Earth: carbon. Ordinary bloomery iron, the kind European blacksmiths worked with for most of the medieval period, contained less than 0.5% carbon, whereas Wootz contained between 1 and 2%. That difference is enormous because carbon is what makes steel hard, and steel with 1.5% carbon is far harder than steel with 0.33%. On the other hand, the harder you make steel, the more brittle it becomes, meaning steel that hard should shatter on impact like glass, and a sword made from it should snap the first time it hits a shield. Wootz, however, did not shatter, and this contradiction mystified every scientist who studied it for 200 years. The steel was harder than it had any right to be, yet it remained flexible enough to forge into thin sword blades that could absorb the shock of combat without cracking. When those blades were polished and etched with mild acid, the surface revealed the visible watered pattern, alternating bands of light and dark steel flowing across the blade like ripples on a pond. This was not decoration, but the visible signature of the metal's internal structure. The 12th century Arab geographer Al-Idrisi put it simply: the Indians excelled in the manufacture of iron, and it was impossible to surpass the edge from Indian steel. So why did this matter so much? Because Wootz solved a problem that no other civilization on the planet had solved. In metallurgy, hardness and toughness are natural enemies. The harder you make steel, the more brittle it becomes. The tougher you make it, the softer the edge. Every European swordsmith in the medieval period was forced to compromise between these two properties. The best they could achieve was a blade with a hard edge and a softer spine. Wootz did not compromise. It was both. And the blades forged from it dominated warfare across the Middle East for roughly 11 centuries. By the late 1600s, tens of thousands of Wootz ingots were crossing the Arabian Sea every year. The Persian phrase for cutting someone with an Indian sword was to give an Indian answer. That's how feared this material was. The reach extended far beyond the Middle East. The famous Ulfbert swords of the Viking era, dating from the 8th to the 11th century, were forged from imported crucible steel that likely originated in Persia or India. Their purity and performance were so far ahead of anything available in Europe at the time that some historians have described them as the assault rifles of the Viking Age. And wootz was not just a weapon material. The forging process itself required extraordinary skill that took years to master. Syrian swordsmiths had to work the metal at temperatures between 650 and 850 degrees Celsius, or 1202 and 1562 degrees Fahrenheit, that had to be low enough to preserve the internal banding structure, but high enough to shape the blade. The best ancient blades show carbide band spacing of 60 to 70 micrometers. Modern smiths are only now learning to match that precision. This was a strategic resource that shaped trade routes, military outcomes, and the balance of power across 3 continents for over 1,000 years. So how did Indian blacksmiths solve a problem that stumped every other civilization on Earth? The answer starts with a clay pot, some charcoal, and a single ingredient so small it would take 200 years of modern science to find it. The science. Indian metallurgists started with either bloomery iron or magnetite ore and packed it into small clay crucibles along with a carbon source. It was typically wood chips from specific trees or bamboo charcoal, and sometimes leaves from particular plants. These crucibles were sealed with a clay lid to create an airtight chamber and placed inside a charcoal furnace. And here's a detail that matters. In some regions, the furnaces were not driven by bellows. They were driven by monsoon winds. Archaeologist Gil Juleff documented this in a landmark paper published in Nature. Other sites, like those sketched by Francis Buchanan during his travels in 1807, used bellows made of buffalo hide. Either way, the engineering behind these furnaces was remarkable. It was robust enough to withstand firing cycles of up to 24 hours at extreme temperatures. The furnace was heated to between 1,300 and 1,400 degrees Celsius, or 2,372 and 2,552 degrees Fahrenheit, and held there for up to a full day. During that time, the iron absorbed carbon from the organic material, lowered its melting point, and liquefied inside the sealed crucible. Then came the critical part. The crucible was removed and allowed to cool slowly, over several days. That slow cooling allowed the carbon to segregate into distinct zones within the crystal structure, rather than distributing evenly. And this segregation was the foundation of everything that made wootz special. The final carbon content is between 1 and 1.6%. Modern metallurgists call this ultra-high carbon steel. At that carbon level, the steel should be hopelessly brittle. But wootz blades were famously flexible, and nobody could explain why. For over 200 years, scientists tried to crack this. Michael Faraday, whose father had been a blacksmith, teamed up with a master cutler named James Stoddart. They added various metals to iron. Nothing worked. At the Paris Mint, a researcher named Briand conducted roughly 300 experiments, adding everything from platinum and gold to uranium. He concluded only that the properties came from carbon, but not how. Then, in the early 1980s, a metallurgist at Iowa State University named John Verhoeven decided to try. Verhoeven partnered with Alfred Pendray, a bladesmith based in Florida, and together they spent over a decade attempting to reproduce authentic wootz patterns in the laboratory. They failed, repeatedly. They used pure iron-carbon alloys. They adjusted temperatures. They varied cooling rates. The famous watered patterns refused to appear. Year after year, the same result. The steel was just steel. Then Verhoeven switched to a different source of iron, something called sorrel meta. It was a very pure type of iron produced from ilmenite ore deposits on the St. Lawrence River in Canada. and the patterns suddenly appeared. But why? Virchow even ran the analysis, and in 1996 he found it. The sorel metal contained approximately 0.04% vanadium, 40 parts per million, a trace impurity so small that no one in 200 years of study had thought to measure it. That tiny amount of vanadium turned out to be the entire secret. Here's what it did. When the Wootz ingot cooled after smelting, the vanadium atoms, along with other trace elements like molybdenum and chromium, were pushed out of the solidifying iron crystals. They accumulated along the boundaries between crystal grains, forming thin sheets running through the steel. When the ingot was later heated and hammered into a blade, these impurity-rich zones acted as nucleation sites, places where an extremely hard compound called iron carbide or cementite clustered preferentially. The result was alternating bands of carbide-rich and carbide-poor steel running through the blade. The hard bands gave it its edge. The softer bands gave it flexibility. And when the surface was etched, those bands produced the famous watered pattern. But the vanadium was only half the story. Because when another team of scientists looked even closer, what they found inside Wootz steel should not have been possible. In 2006, a research team led by Marianne Riebold and Peter Pölfler at the Technische Universität Dresden in Germany got their hands on a section of a 17th century Damascus sabre. The blade had been made by the famous smith Assad Ullah, and it was donated by the Bern Historical Museum in Switzerland. They dissolved a piece of the blade and examined it under a transmission electron microscope. Inside the steel, they found carbon nanotubes, cylinders of single-atom thick carbon with a diameter of roughly half a nanometer, enclosing nanowires of cementite. Their findings were published in Nature. The nanotubes appear to have formed because the trace impurities, the vanadium, the molybdenum, the chromium, catalyzed the growth of carbon structures during the repeated heating and cooling cycles of forging. And these nanotubes may explain how the steel achieved its impossible combination of extreme hardness and resilience, because carbon nanotubes are among the strongest materials ever measured by modern science. How it changed life. Wootz steel reshaped the power dynamics of the medieval world. Before Wootz reached the Middle East through Indian Ocean trade, Arab and Persian armies relied on locally produced bloomery steel that was functional but ordinary. Once Wootz ingots began arriving in quantity, however, the quality of weapons in the Islamic world jumped dramatically, and Damascus became a center of blade production not because it had iron ore or any natural metallurgical advantage, but because it sat at the crossroads of trade routes carrying Wootz from India. The city's smiths then developed specialized forging techniques to work the difficult high-carbon ingots into the curved blades that became their signature. From there, the technology spread outward rapidly. By the 8th century, Wootz-forged blades dominated Islamic weaponry, and by the 10th century, Silk Road networks carried both the steel and the knowledge into Central Asia and China. Even the Viking world may have been touched by Wootz, since the famous Ulfbert swords produced between the 9th and 11th centuries contain unusually pure steel with very low slag content. Some researchers believe these blades were forged from imported crucible steel, possibly Wootz, that travelled through Persian and Russian trade networks northward into Scandinavia. A high-quality Wootz Damascus sword was not a common soldier's weapon, but a marker of status, wealth, and power, with historical accounts suggesting that a finely crafted Wootz blade could cost as much as 3 elephants. Rulers presented them as diplomatic gifts. Warriors passed them down through generations, and the swords that Indian Rajas sent to the Great Exhibition in London in 1851 were decorated with jewels, though the exhibitors made clear that the blades were prized above all for the quality of the steel itself. If this steel was this good for this long, then the obvious question is, why did it disappear? Three forces killed it. The first force arrived in 1740 when English watchmaker Benjamin Huntsman developed a crucible steel process using coke-fired furnaces that could produce consistent, high-quality steel in larger quantities than the Indian process ever managed. By the late 1700s, European crucible steel was being manufactured at industrial scale, and although it lacked the banding or the nanostructure of woots, it was good enough for tools, springs, clock mechanisms, and machine parts while costing a fraction of the price. The economics shifted permanently because there was no longer any reason to import small expensive ingots from halfway around the world when you could make serviceable steel locally in bulk. The second force was geological. Verhoeven and Pendray's research demonstrated that the famous Damascus pattern depended on trace impurities in the original Indian ore, specifically vanadium at concentrations as low as 40 parts per million. Only certain deposits in certain regions produced steel that could develop the characteristic carbide banding, and when those specific deposits were mined out or became inaccessible through political disruption, the raw material for true woots disappeared along with them. Smiths may have continued making crucible steel, but the blades stopped showing the pattern, and without the pattern there was no Damascus steel. The third force was the gun. By the 18th and 19th centuries, firearms had replaced swords as the primary weapon of war across most of the world, collapsing the demand for ultra-high-quality blade steel. Trade routes that once carried tens of thousands of woots ingots per year went quiet, and Indian craftsmen who had passed the knowledge through families for generations found no buyers. The answer is not that we found something better in every respect, but that we found something cheaper and faster. And in the process, we lost a material that modern laboratories are still working to understand. As Verhoeven himself noted, while Woots' legendary reputation for being superior to all modern steel is overstated, the material was genuinely better than anything else available before the 1800s. And the combination of properties it achieved through its nanostructure remains remarkably difficult to replicate even with modern equipment. Modern revival? Not everything was lost. The partnership between Verhoeven and Pendray, which lasted from the early 1980s through the 2000s, succeeded in producing Woots blades with patterns that were microscopically and visually identical to ancient Damascus blades. Pendray continues making Woots in Florida, although he produces fewer than 20 blades per year because the process is extremely labor-intensive and expensive. Other specialist smiths, including Rick Furrer and Ulrich Hennecker, have also successfully produced authentic Woots steel, and Pendray's work attracted the attention of King Abdullah II of Jordan, whose royal smiths travelled to Pendray's workshop in Florida to learn the technique. Meanwhile, researchers at the Central Iron and Steel Research Institute in Beijing are using computational metallurgical software to model the banding mechanism, while researchers in Sweden have produced experimental knife blades. The Wallace Collection in London is studying genuine Damascus blades using neutron diffraction analysis, and in India, the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore continues documenting the archaeological evidence of the industry that started it all. In theory, the materials needed to make Woots are simple: iron, carbon, a clay crucible, and a hot enough fire. In practice, however, the process is extraordinarily difficult because the temperature must reach above 1,300 degrees Celsius or 2,372 degrees Fahrenheit, the carbon content must land in a narrow range, the cooling must be slow and controlled, and without the right trace elements in your iron, you may produce crucible steel but never achieve the banding. Rick Furrer's 50% success rate on forging alone tells you how unforgiving the material remains even for an expert. A Woots ingot sits in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, looking like a rough lump of dark metal weighing about a kilogram, and most visitors walk past it without a second glance. Inside that lump, however, is a nanostructure that modern materials science is still working to fully understand and reliably replicate. We just forgot to ask how it worked before we threw it away. Medieval masons knew a secret about stone that's making modern buildings fall apart before we finish paying for them. Every foundation today takes a single afternoon to pour. A medieval wall took a generation to build. And that missing time is why the driveway at the end of your street is already cracking after 5 years, while Salisbury Cathedral still stands 800 years later on foundations only 4 feet. Because during those decades of building, something happened inside the walls that modern construction has completely lost. Medieval masons, without knowing it, were using chemistry, geology, and living minerals to build structures that could heal themselves from the inside. A system that modern concrete still can't match. Today we're walking back into the medieval quarry because the reason your foundation is failing isn't in a modern engineering textbook. It's been sitting in the 13th century this whole time. Canterbury, 1174. The choir of the cathedral has just burned to the ground. Monks are sifting through warm ash, looking at a ruin so complete they think the church is finished forever. Then a man steps off a ship from France. His name is William of Sens. He is a master mason, and within a year he will rebuild the choir in stone so precisely cut that the joints are almost invisible. His crime, if he makes a mistake, will not be fined. He will be held personally responsible for a building meant to stand for 1,000 years. Now you might think that's extreme. It's just a church. But here's what you need to understand. In medieval Europe, if you got stone wrong, people died. Cathedrals collapsed. Towers fell on villages. Entire crews were buried when a vault dropped. That's why medieval guilds spent 7 years training a stonemason before he was even allowed to lay a block on his own. The punishments for shoddy work were brutal, because when a mason rushed the process, when he skipped the bedding check, when he mixed his mortar wrong, he wasn't just cheating on a job, he was producing a wall that would kill somebody 10 years later. And when your entire civilization depends on buildings that have to outlast your grandchildren, the cost of cheating is too high to accept. That's why the punishments were severe. But here's where it gets interesting. To build the way they did, medieval masons needed something most people today have never heard of. It didn't come from a hardware store. It came from a stone kiln on the edge of town. Every morning, a master mason's apprentice would walk to the outskirts of the city, to a pit lined with firewood where chunks of limestone were burning at around 1,650 degrees Fahrenheit. Out of that pit came a material that looked like chalky, jagged rock, quicklime. And if you dropped water on it, it would hiss, steam, boil, and release enough heat to burn your skin. If you saw a bag of it today, you'd assume it was industrial waste. Medieval masons treated it like treasure. The apprentice would carry blocks of freshly burned lime back to the building site in a wooden cart, dump it into a pit, and slake it with water. The lime would boil, steam would rise in clouds, men would step back and let it react. That pit of hissing, seething paste was the beginning of every medieval wall. They'd let it rest for weeks, sometimes months, sometimes a full year. Then they'd mix it with clean sand, scoop it between the stones by hand, and walk away. Because hidden inside that chalky paste were billions of reactive calcium compounds, an entire chemical system still alive and waiting to work. And when the masons spread that mortar between 2 blocks of limestone, something remarkable started happening. The mortar began pulling carbon dioxide out of the air. It started hardening, slowly, not in hours, but in years. That's the part most people today have never heard of. But there was a second process the mason didn't even know was happening. The mortar was learning to heal itself, a property that modern Portland cement still can't replicate. So what was the medieval masons actually working with? It's called lime mortar, and it's made from 3 ingredients: burned limestone, sand, and water. Here's the part modern construction lost. Medieval lime mortar is a living material. When a hairline crack opens in a medieval joint, rainwater seeps in. It dissolves a tiny amount of reactive lime inside the mortar. That solution flows into the crack. Then it recrystallizes as calcium carbonate, the same mineral that formed limestone in the first place. The crack seals itself. The wall repairs its own wounds, decade after decade, century after century. A research team led by Donardi, publishing in the journal Composites Part B, tested this exact process in a laboratory. They damaged lime mortar specimens, let them heal, and then measured what happened. The mortar recovered between 25 and 40% of its compressive strength on its own, with the youngest samples healing most aggressively. The researchers called it autogenous healing, the mortar doing it with no human intervention, no additives, no repair work, just chemistry and time. Now look at modern concrete. Portland cement, invented by Joseph Aspdin in Leeds in 1824, cures once and stops. It is a dead material. When a crack forms, it stays a crack. It grows. Water gets in. Steel rebar rusts. The steel swells and splits the concrete from the inside. The reinforcement becomes the mechanism of destruction. Modern concrete has no weapon against its own aging. It just fails. Medieval walls repaired themselves. We built walls that sabotaged themselves. The only real difference? Chemistry. But the self-healing mortar wasn't the only secret to their buildings lasting 1,000 years. There was something else in the medieval quarry, something any modern builder would look at and ignore, that was actually protecting every stone from the day it was placed. Walk up to a medieval cathedral wall and run your hand across the blocks. You'd see something a modern architect would never notice. Every stone has been placed in the wall the exact same way it was lying in the quarry. The same face up, the same face down, the same direction of the grain running horizontally, not vertically. This is called the natural bed, and it is the single most important decision a medieval mason ever made. Limestone and sandstone, the stones medieval Europe built almost everything from, were laid down in sedimentary layers over millions of years. Each layer is stronger along one axis than the other. If you place the block so the layers run horizontally, the weight above pushes straight down into the grain, and the stone holds. If you flip it, the weight now pushes along the grain. Water gets between the layers. It freezes. It expands. The stone splits along its own geological weakness. A perfect block of limestone, placed wrong, can shatter in a single winter. A paper published in the International Journal of Materials Science and Applications documented this directly. When sedimentary stone is laid with its bedding plane perpendicular to the downward pressure of the wall, the stone uses its full compressive strength and resists weathering for centuries. When the same stone is set on end, a mistake known as face bedding, water enters the exposed layers, freezes, and the stone delaminates along its own grain, often within decades. Same stone, same wall. The only difference was orientation. Every medieval master mason could read a stone the way a carpenter reads a piece of wood. They knew which face had been the top of the layer in the quarry, which face had been the bottom, which way the grain ran, and which axis would hold weight. Templates and bed molds passed down through workshops for centuries made sure every block landed the right way. That knowledge was so fundamental to their trade, it was invisible, like knowing how to swing a hammer. Now walk onto a modern construction site. Ready-mix concrete has no grain. A cinder block has no natural bed. The materials don't care how you set them, so nobody bothers to learn. We've built an entire industry around materials with no memory, and we lost the skill of reading stone along the way. You can hire a mason today to rebuild a medieval wall and watch him place the stones upside down. Not because he's lazy, because there's nobody left on the crew who was taught to look. But the mortar and the natural bed still weren't enough. Medieval walls did one more thing modern buildings can't do. They breathed. A medieval stone wall is not a barrier. It's a membrane. Water that gets into the wall also gets out. Moisture passes through the joints, through the pores of the stone, through the entire mass of the structure. The wall dries itself. Mold can't grow in a material constantly exchanging moisture with the atmosphere. Now look at modern construction. Portland cement is nearly impermeable. Vapor barriers are added to stop moisture. Waterproof membranes seal everything up. The logic is to keep water out entirely, but water always finds a way in, and when it does, it has nowhere to go. It sits inside the wall. It saturates the concrete. It freezes. It expands. It cracks the wall from the inside, and those cracks let in more water, and the cycle speeds up. Modern buildings trap the very moisture they were designed to exclude. This is not theory. Walk into any basement finished with Portland cement block and a poured concrete floor. The dehumidifier is running. The walls are sweating. Drywall is stained dark at the bottom. Now walk into the crypt of a medieval cathedral. It's dry. It has been dry for 800 years. The stone is breathing. Medieval masons didn't have the vocabulary to explain what they were doing. They called their buildings sound. But what they had built was the most sophisticated passive moisture system ever designed. We call that primitive. It's actually a system modern physics would approve of in a heartbeat. And it's gone. And it gets worse. Because starting in 1824, the industry that killed stone masonry has been rebranding the very material that destroyed it. After Joseph Aspdin patented Portland cement in Leeds, England, his powder conquered the world within a single century. Faster, cheaper, stronger on day one. Everyone switched. Through the mid-20th century, trade schools across the United States quietly dropped stone masonry from the curriculum. Apprenticeships dried up. The last generation that was taught to read a stone like a carpenter reads wood is now in their 70s and 80s, mostly in rural England, Italy, and parts of Germany. Ask a 30-year-old construction worker in America what the natural bed of a stone is. Blank look. The knowledge didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because it stopped being profitable. And now, in a twist most people never notice, the same industry that killed lime mortar is selling it back to you with a different label. Go on any specialty hardware site. Look up historic restoration mortar. You'll see bags of Portland cement cut with a small percentage of lime marketed as traditional or heritage compatible. But here's the trick. That product is still mostly Portland cement. It still doesn't breathe. It still doesn't flex. It still doesn't self-heal. The tiny amount of lime added is marketing, not chemistry. Want to know if you've been scammed? Read the label. Real lime mortar has 3 ingredients: lime, sand, water. That's it. If the bag lists Portland cement, cement clinker, or Type S hydrated lime cut with anything else, it's fake. You're paying premium prices for the same material that's destroying every historic building it gets touched with. The American Society of Civil Engineers published its 2025 Infrastructure Report Card this past spring. The grade for bridges was a C. More than 46,000 bridges in the United States are classified as structurally deficient. 178 million vehicles cross those failing bridges every single day. Estimated rehabilitation cost is $191.3 billion. That's federal data from the FHWA. We built the infrastructure of an entire continent out of a material that has now failed at a scale that will cost the next generation nearly $200 billion to patch up. Meanwhile, Salisbury Cathedral has never been fined for a structurally deficient tower. But here's the good news. You don't need a Portland factory or a 1960s engineering textbook, because the methods medieval masons used are simpler than you think, and they still work. Here's what medieval masons did, and you can do it this weekend. Forget the ready mix. Forget the vapor barriers. Forget the rebar. Medieval masons worked with 3 things: stone, lime, and the knowledge to read both. Here's the method. Step 1. If you're laying any stone, a retaining wall, a garden wall, a patio, a raised bed, look at the block before you set it. Sedimentary stone has visible layers. Turn the stone on its side. You should see thin lines running through it, like pages in a closed book. Those are the bedding layers. Place the stone in the wall so those layers are horizontal, running the same way they would in the ground. If you can't see the layers, rest the stone on a hard surface and tap each face with a chisel. The face that sounds dullest, the one that rings least, is usually the bedding face. Place that face down. Step 2. Skip the Portland cement bag. Buy a bag of natural hydraulic lime sold as NHL2, NHL 3.5 or NHL5 depending on the exposure. NHL 3.5 is the right choice for most outdoor walls in a temperate climate. Specialty suppliers in the US and UK carry it. Mix it with clean, sharp sand at roughly 1 part lime to 2.5 parts sand. Add clean water slowly until the mix feels like thick peanut butter. Don't add Portland cement to strengthen it. That destroys the entire chemistry. Step 3. Before applying the mortar, dampen the stones. Dry stone sucks water out of lime mortar too fast and ruins the cure. A garden spray bottle works fine. The stones should be damp to the touch but not dripping. Step 4. Apply the mortar between the joints. Don't overfill. Use a pointing trowel to press it in, then scrape off the excess. Cover your work with damp burlap or a cloth for the first 3 days. Lime needs slow moisture to cure correctly. If it dries out too fast, it goes chalky and weak. Step 5. Wait. Initial set takes 7 to 14 days, not a few hours. Full strength develops over months, even years. A Portland cement foundation reaches most of its strength in a week. A lime foundation is still getting stronger 20 years after it's laid. That's the trade-off. Speed for permanence. Here's what to expect. After your first attempt, the mortar might look soft. It might look slow. You'll want to press on it. Don't. That's normal. The lime is carbonating, pulling CO2 from the atmosphere, building crystals between the stones. After month 1, the joint feels solid. After year 1, it's harder than the cement you replaced. After a century, it will still be there. Don't repoint a heritage building with Portland cement. Ever. If your house was built before 1920, any masonry work on it should be lime. Portland cement on historic brick is the fastest way to destroy the brick because the cement is harder than the brick and won't move with it. The brick shatters at the joint. One safety note: hydrated lime is caustic. It burns skin and eyes. Wear thick gloves, sealed eye protection, and long sleeves. Keep fresh water nearby for rinsing. Medieval masons managed this risk every day with basic precautions. You can too. If you mess up, scrape the joint out and start again. Lime is cheap. The stone is priceless. That's the entire process medieval builders used to put up cathedrals that have stood for 1,000 years. No rebar, no Portland. Just lime, stone, and the patience to let chemistry do what chemistry does. Walk into an old English farmhouse while it is being gutted, and every so often you will catch a builder making the same discovery. They pry up a cold, cracked concrete floor poured in the 1960s, the kind that has been pulling damp into the walls and rotting the skirting boards for half a century. And sitting underneath it, they find another floor, far older. A hard, dry surface that has been in the dark, doing its job since before the building above it had its current name. The modern floor failed in 40 years. The one beneath it had already lasted 500, and it was made of dirt, lime, and ash. We have been told that medieval floors were filthy, packed mud and rotting straw, crawling with fleas, a hazard our ancestors put up with because they knew no better. That picture is mostly wrong, and the people who laid those floors understood things about moisture, heat, and the chemistry of a living building that we spent the last 100 years forgetting. This is the story of what was really under their feet, how they built it, and why we tore it out for something worse. How does a floor made of dirt outlast the house standing on top of it? To get there, you have to throw out the picture in your head, because almost all of that picture comes from a single bad-tempered letter. In 1524, the Dutch scholar Erasmus wrote to a friend describing English floors. He said they were laid with clay and strewn with rushes so rarely cleaned that the bottom layer might sit undisturbed for 20 years, hiding spit, scraps of fish, grease, bones, and the leavings of dogs and men. That one passage is where almost the entire image of the disgusting medieval floor comes from. It is quoted everywhere. Read it again, though. Erasmus was describing neglect in crowded houses and inns, and he was writing after the medieval period had already ended, taking a swing at English habits for the entertainment of a friend. 20 years was the scandal he was reporting, not the standard. In a working monastery, the dormitory rushes were swept out and replaced once or twice a year, and in finer houses the loose rushes had already given way to woven matting, plaited and laid down like carpet. Some of it still survives in English country houses today. And underneath that covering was not raw dirt, it was a floor that somebody built. For most of the Middle Ages, the standard floor in ordinary European houses was earth, and it stayed in use in rural homes for centuries after that. But beaten earth is a misleading name, because the good version was never just soil walked on until it packed down. It was a recipe. Clay was the binder, the thing that held everything together as it dried. Sand and grit gave it strength under load. Chopped straw ran through it the way steel rebar runs through a modern slab, tying the whole thing together and stopping it from cracking as it shrank. Into the mix went wood ash and water, which reacted with the clay and bound it harder, closer to a soft natural cement than to mud. Then it had to be compacted, and this is the best detail in the whole story. You did not tamper floor like this alone. You called the neighbours. As many people as the household could gather would come and tread the wet floor, back and forth, for an entire afternoon, sometimes longer, until the surface was flat, dense and smooth. Think about that for a second. The making of the floor was a social event, the way a barn raising was, and what you ended up with was not a thin skin of mud, but a bound surface several inches thick that behaved more like soft stone than soil. People had literally walked it into being. A bare earth floor still has one weakness. It dusts. Dry clay powders underfoot, which is why the good floors were sealed. The usual sealer was a drying oil, most often linseed, worked into the surface in coat after coat. Linseed does not just dry on top. It cures, the molecules cross-linking into a tough, water-resistant film bonded into the clay itself, and a floor finished this way could be waxed and polished to a hard, dark sheen that lasted for centuries. In some regions, builders reached for something stranger. They worked milk or blood into the surface. That sounds like superstition. It is chemistry. Milk carries casein and blood carries albumin, and both are proteins that set hard and turn water-resistant once they cure. Britain's building conservation literature records that medieval earth and lime floors were sometimes mixed with milk or blood to leave a partially waterproof skin that kept the damp down. Few of those floors survived to be studied, but the technique is real, and it was doing the same job a modern sealant does, with the only binders a farm could produce for free. That covering on top of the floor is worth stopping on because it hides the cleverest thing the medieval household did, and almost nobody mentions it. The rushes were not just for cushioning and warmth. People scattered specific plants through them, and the choice had nothing to do with making the room smell nice. Look at the names: fleabane, wormwood, pennyroyal, tansy. Every one of them contains compounds that repel or kill insects, and people knew it. In 1557, Thomas Tusser put it in plain verse, telling readers to save wormwood seed so that where the chamber is swept and the wormwood is strewn, no flea would dare show itself. Think about what that actually is. In an age with no insecticides, in homes that shared their space with livestock and had no way to seal away food, people were laying a renewable botanical pesticide across the floor of every room. Meadowsweet, the herb Queen Elizabeth reportedly wanted strewn in her chambers above all others, is loaded with salicylates, the same chemical family that gives us aspirin. This was a working pest control and sanitation layer, built straight into the floor, in a world that had no other version of it. The royal household accounts even show it running as a paid job, with men hired specifically to keep the king's chamber supplied with fresh rushes. In some English parishes, the cutting and laying of those rushes became a fixed event in the year, a communal harvest in late spring that survived as a festival called rush bearing, long after anyone could remember why the floors had ever needed it. That same practical, hands-on knowledge ran straight through the medieval kitchen, and we have put the cooking side of it into plain working guides at the Medieval Way store. A sourdough manual built on how they actually baked, a collection of refined period recipes, and a sourcing guide for tracking down the real ingredients. If you want to cook the way these people built, the link is in the description. Now, back to the floor, because the next problem these builders solved was the one directly over their heads. You cannot lay a beaten earth floor on an upper story. It is too heavy, and there is no ground beneath it to press against. The answer, in parts of England where lime was easy to come by, was one of the most overlooked building materials in the country's history. The lime ash floor. Lime ash was, in the most literal sense, garbage. It was the residue raked out of the bottom of a wood-fired lime kiln, leftover lime mixed with wood ash that would otherwise have been thrown out. Builders took that residue, combined it with sand and aggregate, often gypsum, sometimes even animal hair for strength, and spread it over a bed of reeds laid across the floor joists. As it set, it hardened into a solid, slightly springy slab so tough that today people regularly mistake it for concrete. A family could be walking across what was effectively a sheet of set lime suspended a full story in the air, with nothing under it but reeds and timber and total confidence in the mix. In hundreds of surviving buildings, it still holds. And these floors could be finished to a startling degree. At Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire, one of the great houses of Elizabethan England, the top surface was buffed to a sheen with a mixture of egg white, curdled milk, and isinglass, a gelatin made from fish. A floor polished with egg, milk, and fish glue is not the work of people who did not care what they walked on. Now for the honest part, because your floor history has to survive a fact check, and this audience runs one. The lime ash floor is not mainly a medieval invention. These floors are well documented from the 16th century onward. Genuine 13th and 14th century examples are rare, and 15th century ones only a little less so. The technique grew out of the medieval world and then exploded in the centuries that followed. But it does reach back. Archaeologists excavating a medieval manor at Bingham in Nottinghamshire found a gypsum plaster and lime ash floor that ranks among the earliest of its kind recognised in England. And Cote Haley House in Cornwall, a mansion whose origins go back to around the year 1300, holds a lime ash floor laid in 1520 that is still in place. Most people have never heard that a floor can last 5 centuries and still be in service. These can. Some still are. We know all of this the way we know most things about ordinary medieval life. By digging. A floor is one of the most useful things an archaeologist can find because unlike a wall or a roof, it stays exactly where it was laid. A packed earth surface shows up as a hard, level band in the soil, often with a slot along one edge where a timber wall plate once sat and the objects trodden into it, a lost coin, a broken pot, a fishbone, date the surface and quietly describe the room that once stood above it. The Bingham floor was read this way, against the documents, which is how it earned its place as one of the earliest examples recognised in the country. By now you might notice these floors have almost nothing in common in their materials. Beaten clay, oiled earth, lime and kiln ash. But they share one property, and it is the single most important thing these builders understood and we forgot. Every one of them could breathe. A medieval house had nothing sealing it off from the earth, no concrete foundation, no damp-proof course, no sheet of plastic between the building and the ground. Moisture rose out of the soil, passed up through the porous floor, evaporated into the room, and left again through walls of lime mortar and stone that were just as permeable. The whole building handled water by letting it move through and escape, instead of trying to block it. The floor stayed sound because it was never asked to hold the water back. It was only ever asked to let it pass. That is the first of 3 jobs the floor was doing, and it is the one the modern building trade spent decades getting wrong. The second is heat. A few feet down, the ground holds a steady temperature all year, around 10 degrees Celsius in a climate like Britain's. A thick earth or lime floor sits in direct contact with that enormous stable mass, slow to warm and slow to cool, which flattens the temperature swings in the room above it. The floor does not feel warm the way a heater feels warm. It feels steady. It was a thermal flywheel, built into the ground, and it cost nothing to run. The third job belonged to the lime floors in particular. Fresh lime is a strong alkali with a very high pH, and very little can grow on a surface that hostile. While it was fresh, a lime floor actively resisted mold, bacteria, and the things that breed in a damp house, which is exactly why lime was slathered on cellar walls, dairy floors, and sick rooms for centuries. There is a limit to this, and you should know it, because someone in the comments will. The effect fades. As the lime reacts with the air, it slowly turns back into ordinary calcium carbonate. The pH drops, and the antimicrobial bite wears off. A fresh lime floor is a mild disinfectant. A 100-year-old one is just a very good floor. Put the 3 together. A surface that moved moisture out instead of trapping it, stored the day's heat and gave it back at night, and started out hostile to the things that make a house sick. That is a floor doing real work. A modern floor is asked to do one thing: hold still and look flat, and everything else is treated as someone else's department. The same invention that finally made floors cheap, fast, and identical everywhere was the thing that quietly broke them. Ordinary Portland cement existed in the 19th century, but it became cheap and widely available between the world wars, and it changed flooring for good. A poured cement slab is strong, level, and quick to lay. It is also, compared to everything before it, very nearly waterproof. It does not breathe. For a new building designed around it, that is fine. The trouble started when people took these sealed modern floors and dropped them into old buildings that were never built for them. An old house was a system that let moisture rise and evaporate, and the breathing floor was part of that system. Seal it under impermeable cement, and the water that used to leave through it does not stop arriving. It goes sideways instead, into the base of the walls, and it climbs. Damp that a building never suffered in 400 years can appear within a few of the improvement. The owner calls it rising damp, injects the walls with chemicals, and often pours more cement to fix it. The cottage gets written off as too old and too wet to save. The real culprit is a bag of cement and a roll of plastic. This is no longer a fringe view. Conservation and heritage bodies in Britain now warn against putting cement floors into traditional buildings, and the repair they recommend is to go backward, to lay a breathable lime or limecrete floor and let the building dry itself out the way it was meant to. We did not forget how to make these floors because they failed. We forgot because something faster came along, and the faster thing hid its cost for decades before the damp showed up in the wall. None of this knowledge is actually lost. It was written down, it has been studied, and it is being used again, and the method is simple enough to follow, even if doing it well takes practice. A traditional earth floor today follows the medieval logic almost exactly. You start with a stable, well-drained base. Over it goes a mix of clay, sand, and chopped straw in proportions that resist cracking, troweled on and levelled in layers, each one left to dry. Then you seal the whole thing with a drying oil, linseed being the classic choice, coat after coat until the surface stops drinking it in, and a wax finish on top leaves a floor that is warm underfoot, good to look at, and repairable with a handful of the same mix. A lime floor asks for more respect. The material is caustic while it is fresh, the same property that makes it antimicrobial, so it has to be handled with proper protection. But the principle holds. It breathes, it manages moisture, and it ages into a hard polished surface instead of cracking and lifting the way a thin cement screed does. And if you live in an old house with damp creeping up the walls, this is not trivia. The most useful thing it tells you is to find out what your floors and walls are actually made of before you seal anything, because a breathing building wants breathing materials, and the wrong modern floor can cause the exact problem you are trying to cure. For most of human history, the floor was the most honest part of the house. It could not hide behind paint or plaster. It got walked on every day by everyone, and it had to earn that. People mixed clay and ash and lime and oil, called in the neighbours to tread it flat, polished it with egg and milk, and left surfaces that have outlasted the families who laid them and the kings who taxed them. The floor under your feet right now will almost certainly not be here in 500 years. Theirs still are. Year 1936. A farmer named Hugo Kraft is ploughing a peat bog on the island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea. His plough snags on something heavy. He digs it up. What he pulls from the mud is a wooden chest banded with iron that has been sitting in that bog for nearly 1,000 years. Inside the chest are over 200 iron tools, hammers, pincers, files, drill bits, saw blades, axe heads. The chest belonged to a Viking blacksmith who buried it sometime around the year 1000, possibly to hide it from raiders. He never came back for it. What most archaeologists in 1936 could not explain was the most remarkable thing about the find. After 936 years in waterlogged ground, the iron was largely intact. Several of the tools were still functional, and the metal had come from the same swamp the chest was buried in. Today, we're going to show you exactly how a medieval blacksmith working with bog water and bacteria produced iron that survives conditions that destroy modern steel within decades, why we abandoned the technology, and why materials scientists are quietly studying it again. Northern Europe, around the year 800. The Viking Age is beginning. The Carolingian Empire is consolidating power across Western Europe. And every kingdom that wants to survive needs the same thing: iron. Iron for nails, hinges, ship rivets, ploughshares, axe heads, swords, and armour. Without iron, you cannot farm efficiently, you cannot build a navy, and you cannot defend a border. The problem is that iron was hard to come by. Rock iron ore, the kind you mine from a hillside, requires deep shafts, organised labour, and access to specific geological deposits. In central Sweden, in the mountains of Norway, across most of what is now Denmark, those deposits were either inaccessible or had not yet been discovered. The same was true across much of northern Germany, Poland, and the Baltic coast. Yet these regions produced an enormous quantity of iron objects during the early medieval period. Archaeological surveys at Helgö in Sweden, at Trelleborg in Denmark, and at hundreds of smaller sites across Scandinavia have documented iron production on what historians describe as an industrial scale, decades or even centuries before any actual mines were dug. So where was the iron coming from? It was coming from the bogs, from the wetlands, from the peat marshes that covered millions of acres of northern European lowland, and it was being produced not by trained miners or specialist guilds, but by ordinary peasants. A farmer in 10th century Sweden could walk to a marsh, pull iron-rich nodules out of the muck with a wooden rake, and by year's end have a working axe head. That is not a folk tale. The archaeological record proves it. To understand how it was possible, you have to understand something about the ground these people were walking on, because the bogs were not sitting passively with iron in them. The bogs were making iron, continuously, through a biological process that nobody at the time understood, but that they had learned to harvest with extraordinary precision. A bog is a particular kind of wetland. It forms where waterlogged ground is acidic enough and oxygen poor enough to prevent normal decomposition. Plant matter falls into the water, partially rots, and becomes peat. The water itself often runs through soils containing dissolved iron compounds, leached out of glacial till and bedrock by groundwater that has been moving slowly through the landscape for thousands of years. This dissolved iron travels through the bog as ferrous iron, a chemical state that stays in solution as long as the water has very little oxygen in it, but at the surface of the bog, where water meets air, oxygen becomes available again. And there, something interesting happens. Specific bacteria, including species like Gallionella ferruginea and Leptothrix ochrosea, feed on this iron. They strip electrons from the dissolved iron atoms to power their own metabolism. The waste product is a solid form of iron oxide, rust, essentially. Except this rust accumulates around the bacterial colony in concentrated nodules. Over the course of decades, those nodules grow. Some grow to the size of a fist. Some grow to the size of a melon. They are dark brown or rust red, lumpy, irregular, and absolutely packed with iron oxide. Modern chemical analysis of bog ore from Scandinavia shows iron content ranging from 30 to 60% by mass. Lower than a high-grade rock mine, but high enough to smelt economically using medieval technology. Here is the part that nobody talks about. The bogs do not run out. After a community harvests the nodules, the bacteria continue working. The dissolved iron continues flowing in, and within 20 to 30 years, the same bog produces a fresh crop. Medieval Swedish records show that specific bogs were assigned to specific families on rotation cycles. A farmer harvested his marsh, knowing his grandchildren would harvest it again. This was renewable iron production, at a scale modern mining has never matched in any meaningful sense, because we no longer think of metal as a crop. If you live in the northern half of the world, somewhere with wetlands or peat ground, you have probably seen this material yourself without recognizing it. The signs are specific. A rust-orange tinge to slow-moving creek water, a thin rainbow film on standing puddles, easily mistaken for oil pollution, reddish or chocolate-brown mud in seeps along stream banks, hard lumpy nodules just under the surface in marshy ground. That is the same stuff a Viking farmer was harvesting 1,000 years ago. It is still forming under your feet. The harvest was straightforward. In late summer, when water levels were lowest, peasants waded into the bog with long-handled tools and felt along the bottom for the weight of an iron nodule. They pulled it free, knocked off the loose mud, and tossed it into a basket on a wooden sled. A skilled harvester could pull several hundred pounds in a single day. The work was cold, wet, exhausting, and largely invisible to history. It produced the raw material that built the Viking world. Once collected, the ore was dried, sometimes for weeks, then roasted on a layer of charcoal at temperatures between 600 and 800 degrees Celsius, or 1112 to 1472 degrees Fahrenheit. This drove off remaining water, broke the ore into fragments, and converted the iron compounds into a form that would yield metallic iron in the next stage. The result was a pile of dark, brittle, iron-rich material, ready for the bloomery. A bloomery is a clay or stone chimney, 3 to 5 feet tall, with a hole at the bottom for air to enter and a hole at the top for waste gases to escape. Charcoal is loaded in from the top. Bog ore, broken into small chunks, is added in alternating layers. A leather bellows operated by hand or foot forces a steady stream of air into the bottom, raising the internal temperature to roughly 1,200 degrees Celsius, or 2,192 degrees Fahrenheit. Critically, this temperature is below the actual melting point of pure iron, which is around 1,538 degrees Celsius. Medieval bloomery operators were performing what we now call a solid-state chemical reduction, although they would not have described it that way. Inside the furnace, carbon monoxide produced by burning charcoal stripped oxygen atoms away from the iron compounds in the ore. Pure metallic iron formed as small spongy particles suspended in molten slag that slowly drifted to the bottom of the furnace and stuck together. After 8 to 12 hours of continuous bellows work, the operator broke open the side of the furnace and pulled out a porous, irregular sponge of iron and slag, 20 to 40 pounds, the size of a loaf of bread. This is called a bloom. To turn it into something useful, the smith reheated it, hammered it, folded it, and hammered it again for hours, sometimes for days. Each blow drove out slag. Each fold welded new layers together. The result was wrought iron, ready to be shaped into a tool or weapon. This is where medieval iron picks up the third critical feature, the one that explains the corrosion resistance. The slag never fully leaves. Even in a fully worked bloom, between 1 and 3% of the final iron mass is still slag, distributed as thin elongated stringers throughout the metal. Modern metallurgists used to consider these inclusions a defect. We now understand they are part of why the iron survives. The other key element is phosphorus. Bog ore is naturally rich in it, far richer than most rock ores, because phosphorus accumulates in wetlands through the decay of organic material. Iron made from bog ore typically contains 0.3 to 1.5% phosphorus. In modern steelmaking, anything above 0.04% is considered a contaminant because it makes high-carbon steel brittle. The medieval smith was making wrought iron, very low in carbon. And in wrought iron, phosphorus promotes the formation of a thin, stable layer of ferric phosphate on the surface that protects everything underneath from further corrosion. This is the same effect that allows the famous Iron Pillar of Delhi, erected around the year 400 in northern India, to stand exposed to monsoon rain and tropical humidity for over 1,600 years with only a thin film of surface rust. Modern analysis confirmed its corrosion resistance comes from phosphorus content between 0.18 and 0.25%, combined with its slag-rich wrought iron microstructure. The same principles apply to medieval European bog iron, often at even higher phosphorus levels. There is a trade-off, and it matters. Bog iron is soft. It is useless as a cutting edge. That is why high-end Viking swords combined a bog iron core with imported crucible steel cutting edges, and why pattern-welded blades layered the two together. The peasant smith was forging the iron skeleton of medieval life. Nails, rivets, ploughshares, hinges, hooks, and ship fittings. Sword steel was a different problem. The iron we still find in archaeological sites is bog iron because it was structural, not combat. It did not get broken and recycled. You now have all three ingredients: a renewable ore source rich in phosphorus, a low-temperature smelting process that preserves slag, and a forging method that distributes those inclusions evenly. Take any one away and you do not get the same result. Combine them and you get a metal that, buried in the same waterlogged environment that produced its raw material, can sit for a millennium with very little degradation. Which brings us back to that chest in the Gotland bog. The Mastermere blacksmith buried his tools to hide them from a raiding party, with no thought of metallurgy or archaeology or 1,000 years from now. But the iron he had made, using ore from the same wetland network where his chest came to rest, was perfectly suited to surviving that exact environment. The bog gave him the iron, the bog protected it. When a farmer's plough pulled it out in 1936, the same metallurgical structure that had preserved Viking-age tool collections for 9 centuries was still intact. But the Mastermere chest is not unique. It is not even rare. Across the entire range of medieval bog iron production, archaeologists have recovered iron objects in conditions that should be impossible. The Snapeboat burial in Suffolk, England, from the late 6th century, contained iron rivets and weapon fittings still retaining metallic structure after 1,400 years in damp soil. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway from around 834 produced iron nails and tool fragments that conservators could clean and stabilise rather than just photograph before they crumbled. At Helgö in Sweden, where bog iron production ran for nearly 800 years, the slag heaps still contain identifiable forging waste from the 4th through the 11th centuries. While we have been focused on Scandinavia, the same techniques produce the same results across Poland, Belarus, Ireland, Scotland, the Netherlands, and the northern German plain. In some regions, the practice continued well into the 19th century, and the tradition crossed the Atlantic. American colonial farmers in the 17th and 18th centuries produced their own iron from coastal pine barren bogs, using techniques essentially identical to those of Viking-age Sweden. The pine barrens of southern New Jersey alone supported dozens of furnace towns: Martha's Furnace, Allaire, Batstow, and Atsion. Some of the cannonballs fired during the American Revolution were made from bog iron smelted in those forests. The preserved Atsion mansion, built in the 1820s, still has iron windowsills, lintels, and door thresholds that remain glossy and rust-free more than 2 centuries later, in a coastal humid climate that tears modern carbon steel apart. The corrosion resistance has been studied repeatedly. A 2009 paper in Corrosion Science examined medieval iron nails from Polish archaeological sites dated between the 9th and 12th centuries. The researchers documented surface oxide layers between 50 and 200 micrometers thick that had effectively stopped further corrosion within decades of the nails being deposited. The cores of the nails were still metallic iron. Modern industrial mild steel, by contrast, will rust through completely under the same burial conditions in 100 to 200 years. A separate 2017 study in Materials Characterization compared bog iron artifacts with modern reproductions made using rock iron raw materials and identical forging methods. The reproductions did not behave the same way. The conclusion was that the ore source itself, not just the technique, mattered. Modern blacksmiths can mimic every step of the process, but unless they are using actual bog ore, with its specific chemistry and bacterial fingerprint, they do not get the same metal coming out. The standard explanation for why bog iron disappeared is that better technology replaced it. That explanation is wrong, or at least incomplete. Bog iron did not lose a fair competition, it lost an enclosure. For roughly 1,500 years, iron production in Northern Europe had been a peasant industry. The bogs were communal. The knowledge belonged to families. A village smith who knew which marsh produced the best ore, which charcoal burned hottest, which folding pattern drove out the most slag, was a man whose skills could not be taken from him because they lived inside his head and his hands. The iron he made paid his taxes, armed his neighbours, and built his church. He answered to no foundry owner. That arrangement was the problem. Beginning in the 15th century and accelerating sharply through the 17th and 18th, the great iron-producing regions of Europe were reorganised from the top down. In Sweden, the Crown restricted bog ore extraction and channeled production into the licensed bruk, the centralised ironworks of the Bergslagen region. In England, the enclosure movement privatised the wetlands that had been common land for centuries. In the German states, princes consolidated forging under licensed ironmasters. Where peasants had once smelted iron on their own farms in their own time, they were now required to deliver ore to centralized works for wages, to be smelted by men they did not know in furnaces they did not own. The blast furnace arrived in this environment, and it was a perfect fit. It required capital. It required specialized labor. It required a continuous supply of ore from a fixed location. It made iron production legible to the state and profitable to the investor. It also produced cast iron, which behaves differently from wrought iron and which most peasant smiths did not know how to refine on its own terms. The skills that mattered in the new system were different from the skills the old system had built. By the time the Bessemer process arrived in 1856 and made industrial steel cheaper than any handcraft alternative, the bog harvest was already a relic. The Bessemer process was the funeral. The death had happened centuries earlier, in legal codes and land registers, not in foundries. We lost more than a technology in that transition. We lost a model of production where ordinary people could meet their own needs without asking permission. The 1,000-year corrosion resistance was almost a side effect. The real casualty was the independence the technology had supported. The natural question at this point is whether anyone is making bog iron today. The answer is yes, by people who understand exactly what they are working with and exactly what they are giving up. In central France, a project called Guédelon Castle has been building a 13th century fortress from scratch since 1997 using only period materials. Their on-site smithy produces iron from local soil, the way a medieval smith would have done it. Independent blacksmiths across Scandinavia, Iceland, and the northeastern United States run periodic bog iron smelts as research and craft. The output is small. The labour is enormous. A modern hobbyist might produce in a year what a medieval village produced in a season. The harder question is why industrial steelmaking does not just add phosphorus to mild steel at scale. The technical answer is that you can. A few specialty grades already do. The economic answer is that there is no market for it. Modern buildings, vehicles, and infrastructure are built for replacement cycles measured in decades. A 1,000-year nail in a building rated for 50 years is a manufacturing cost with no return. This is the part of the story the romance of forgotten technology tends to skip. Modern steel never lost a quality competition to bog iron. Modern steel is harder, more uniform, more versatile, and easier to produce than wrought iron ever was. What it does not do is last. The trade-off was real, and the choice was rational. So the knowledge survived. The economic case for using it did not. Whether that was a fair trade depends entirely on how long you expect the things you build to be standing. The Mastermere tool chest now sits in a glass case at the Swedish History Museum in Stockholm. Visitors walk past it, glance at the rust-coloured objects inside, and move on. What they are looking at represents 1,500 years of peasant knowledge, encoded into the chemistry of the metal itself. A knowledge base that supported the agriculture, the shipbuilding, and the warfare of every culture in Northern Europe, from the late Roman period through the Middle Ages. A knowledge base we set aside in roughly 2 generations because the new industrial economy required iron that could be measured, owned, and shipped, not iron that anyone with access to a marsh could make. The blacksmith of Mastermere could not have explained the metallurgy. What he passed on was simpler. If you cut the right marsh in the right month, dried the ore for the right number of weeks, ran the bloomery for the right number of hours, and hammered the bloom for the right number of hours after that, you got iron that would still be iron when your great-great-grandchildren dug it up. Knowledge passed down through 50 generations. Lost in 2. American highways crack in 7 years. A third of US bridges are structurally deficient. The concrete sidewalk in front of your house was poured in 1998 and is already crumbling. Now look at the Roman pier in the harbour of Caesarea Maritima, off the coast of modern Israel, poured by King Herod's engineers in 22 BC, submerged in salt water for 2,047 years. The concrete is not falling apart. It is growing aluminum tobermorite crystals inside itself that make it harder every year. The Pantheon Dome in Rome has held itself up since 126 AD, 43 metres across, with no steel, no rebar, and no major repairs in 1900 years. The recipe behind both buildings was documented by Vitruvius in 30 BC and rediscovered by MIT, UC Berkeley, and Princeton in the last 20 years. Volcanic ash, quicklime mixed hot, crushed pottery, aggregate that gets lighter as you go up, lime crystals that reseal cracks the moment water touches them. Almost none of it has ever appeared in a bag of modern American cement. These are the 7 Roman concrete secrets that modern construction companies have spent 100 years burying. Number 1. Pozzolana, the volcanic ash from Pozzuoli. Walk down to the Bay of Naples, 16 kilometers west of the city. The town there is called Pozzuoli. By the year 79 AD, when Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii, this town had been shipping its volcanic ash to every harbour in the empire for 2 centuries. Vitruvius wrote about it in 30 BC in De Architectura, Book 2, Chapter 6. He said this ash, mixed with lime and seawater, set into a stone harder than the cliffs on which Rome was built. He was not exaggerating. The Romans were exporting roughly 250,000 tons of pozzolana per year by the 2nd century. Volcanic ash is glass, blasted into the atmosphere by an eruption full of reactive silica and alumina. Mix that glass powder with lime and water, and the silica and alumina bond into calcium aluminum silicate hydrate, a different mineral than what Portland cement forms, stronger, slower setting, self-healing. In 1824, an English bricklayer named Joseph Aspdin patented Portland cement. Portland was cheap, fast, and could be made anywhere with a limestone quarry and a coal fire. Within 50 years, it had replaced pozzolanic concrete worldwide. The Roman recipe still worked. It just was not patentable, and the volcanic ash source was 800 kilometres from the English steel mills. The Pozzuoli ash sat in its warehouses for the next century. You do not need to fly to Pozzuoli to mix this yourself. Metakaolin, the calcined kaolin clay sold to potters, is the cheapest and most reliable substitute. Pumice powder from a masonry or aquarium supplier works just as well. $30 to $50 for 40 pounds. 1 part by volume in your mix. That single ingredient does what Portland cement cannot. Bay of Naples ash worked. The next ingredient was hiding in every kiln for 2,000 years, until MIT figured out the Romans had been mixing it wrong on purpose. Number 2. Hot mixing with quicklime, the recipe error that ran for 2 centuries. In January 2023, an MIT engineer named Admir Masick published a paper in Science Advances. He had been studying samples from the walls of Privernum, an archaeological site about 100 kilometres southeast of Rome. The walls were poured around 30 BC, still standing. Under the electron microscope, the samples kept showing small white chunks, 1 to 3 millimetres wide, embedded in the concrete matrix. Modern chemists had been calling these lime clasts for 50 years and assumed they were defects. Sloppy mixing by Roman workers. A flaw in the recipe. Masick ran X-ray diffraction. He tested fresh concrete mixed 3 different ways. The lime clasts were not flaws, they were the entire point. For 200 years, every Western textbook has taught the same recipe. Start with slaked lime, calcium hydroxide, the white powder you buy at the masonry supply. Mix it with water, add your ash, add your aggregate, build. The Romans did not do that. They started with quicklime, calcium oxide, the hot caustic powder you get straight out of a lime kiln before water touches it. They mixed the dry quicklime directly into the pozzolana and the aggregate, then added water last, all at once. The reaction is violent. Quicklime hitting water reaches 150 degrees Celsius in seconds. The mix steamed for hours. The lime clasts that survived the violent reaction stayed in the wall as reservoirs of unreacted calcium carbonate, sitting there for centuries, waiting. Modern manuals taught the slaked version because slaked lime is safer to handle, easier to ship, and easier to standardize in a factory. The textbooks lost the technique that mattered most. Masick put it back on the table in 2023. Almost no commercial cement plant has changed since. If you want to try this yourself, the safe path is Type S hydrated lime, $10 per 50 pounds, mixed with water before the other ingredients. The Roman path is Type Q quicklime, dry mixed with your pozzolan and aggregate, water added last and fast. The Roman path bakes the self-healing clasts into the wall. It is also caustic enough to burn skin on contact. Leather gloves, safety glasses, and a respirator are non-negotiable. The reservoirs in those walls were doing something specific. The third secret was hiding above your head all along, in the dome of the most visited Roman building in the world. Number 3. The aggregate gradient in the Pantheon dome. In 126 AD, Hadrian completed the Pantheon in Rome. The dome above the rotunda is 43.3 meters across. The largest unreinforced concrete dome ever built, holding itself up for 1900 years without any steel, rebar, or major repair. The Romans solved the weight problem by changing the recipe as they built upward. The lowest 12 meters use heavy basalt and travertine, the same dense stone that paved the Appian Way. The middle uses brick and ceramic rubble. The upper section uses lightweight tuff, a porous volcanic rock that floats in water. The crown, closest to the oculus, uses pure pumice, 800 kilograms per cubic meter, against 3,400 for basalt. The dome gets lighter as it gets higher. The weight at the base loads onto 8 relieving arches in the drum. The weight at the top, where collapse would normally happen, drops by 60% through aggregate choice alone. The 9-meter oculus is held open by shear compression geometry. The Pantheon does not crack because nothing inside it can rust. Modern reinforced concrete pours from one truck with one recipe. Same mix at the base as at the crown. The variable that lets you build a Pantheon was traded away for assembly line efficiency. Cheaper to specify steel rebar and let it rust on schedule. On a home scale, you do not need to gradient your mix unless you are building a dome or a vault. For a flat footing, a garden wall, or a fire pit, one mix with basalt aggregate is fine. 2 grades, 3 to 6 mm fine and 10 to 20 mm coarse. 4 parts by volume against 1 part lime and 1 part pozzolan. The crushed greystone landscapers use for French drains is exactly the right thing. 3 secrets so far. The 4th broke into mainstream news in 2023, and 3 commercial laboratories have been trying and failing to replicate it since. Number 4. Self-healing concrete, the lime-clast mechanism. This is the discovery that broke the story in 2023. Masick's team cast a Roman-style sample using the hot mixing technique, cracked it under load, and dripped water through the crack. 2 weeks later, the crack was sealed. The matching samples mixed with the modern slaked lime recipe stayed cracked. The mechanism is almost embarrassingly simple. Picture a hairline crack opening in a Roman wall. The lime clasts embedded in the mix are reservoirs of unreacted calcium carbonate. When water reaches a clast, it dissolves it. The dissolved calcium flows into the crack as a saturated solution, and when it loses the water by evaporation, it recrystallizes as fresh calcium carbonate, the same mineral. The crack fills itself in real time, and the wall keeps standing. Masick published in Science Advances in January 2023. Marie Jackson at the University of Utah confirmed the same mechanism in her own marine samples. Every concrete wall they examined, from northern Britain to North Africa, contained these lime clasts. Modern concrete contains none. Now look at what this means for industry. The American ready-mix concrete market is worth roughly $76 billion a year, and the bulk of it is replacement work. Bridges that fail in 50 years, sidewalks that crack in 20, parking garages that spall in 30. If concrete healed itself the way a Roman wall does, the replacement market would collapse. Two MIT spin-offs have been working on commercial self-healing concrete since 2018, using biological additives, encapsulated polymers, and bacterial spores. The cost per cubic meter is roughly 4 times the cost of standard Portland. The Roman version costs almost nothing extra. The only difference is the mixing temperature and the order of operations. Dozens of patents have been filed since the 1990s, and most of them sit in the vaults of large cement manufacturers, unused. If you are wondering how that is even legal, so is everyone else. If you use the hot mix from number 2, you have already built the self-healing into the wall. The lime clasts are sitting in the matrix, waiting. You do not need a biological additive or an MIT spin-off product. Every hairline crack that opens in your slab over the next 1,000 years will close itself the next time water touches it. Number 5 is older than the Pantheon. The Romans called it cocciopesto, and they lined every aqueduct in the empire with it. If you are finding value in this investigation, subscribe. Medieval Way digs up the things modern industry would rather you forget. 3 more secrets to go. The aqueduct lining, the pier that gets harder underwater, and the steel reinforcement trap. Number 5. Cocciopesto, the crushed pottery aqueduct lining. We have 3 Roman techniques above ground and 1 in the laboratory. The next one is what made every Roman city possible, the water supply itself. In 144 BC, the consul Quintus Marcius Rex completed the Aqua Marcia, the longest of the 11 aqueducts that fed Rome. 91 kilometers from the springs of the Anio Valley to the urban distribution tanks. Roughly 187,000 cubic meters of water moving through standing pipe, channel, and arch every day. And it had to do it without leaking. The Romans lined every meter of the aqueduct with a mortar called cocciopesto. 3 parts crushed terracotta pottery, 2 parts lime, 1 part sand. The pottery was ground to a fine pink dust from broken amphorae, roof tiles, and kitchenware. When you fire clay above 800 degrees Celsius, the silica and alumina in it are partially activated, the same way they are in volcanic ash. Fired pottery dust is pozzolana you can make in any kitchen kiln. Cocciopesto is waterproof, slightly flexible, and self-healing through the same calcium carbonate mechanism. The Aqua Marcia ran for almost 500 years without major repair. The Pont du Gard in southern France used cocciopesto on its upper conduit and was still partly functional in the 17th century. A modern concrete water main has a design service life of 50 years. The cement industry today uses 0 ground pottery in its standard mix. This is one of the simplest medieval recipes you can mix in an afternoon. Save broken pots, broken roof tiles, terracotta planter rejects. Smash them into a fine pink dust with a hammer and a heavy canvas bag. 3 parts pottery dust, 2 parts hydrated lime, 1 part sand. Mix to a stiff paste. This is the right mortar for the joints in a garden wall, the floor of a fish pond, the inside of a rain cistern. Anything that has to hold water for decades. Cocciopesto lined the aqueducts. The next secret built the harbours, and it is the only concrete on Earth that gets stronger the longer it stays underwater. Number 6. Seawater concrete, the marine mix that strengthens underwater. 22 BC. Caesarea Maritima, on the coast of what is now northern Israel. King Herod the Great is building a deep water harbour on a stretch of coastline with no natural bay. His engineers pour concrete blocks the size of small houses, lower them into 30 meters of Mediterranean water, and cement them to the seabed. The pillars they build still hold up the foundations of a harbour that no Mediterranean state has built since, anywhere, which looking back was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Marie Jackson, a geologist at the University of Utah, spent a decade sampling those Caesarea piers. Her papers in American Mineralogist between 2013 and 2017 traced what happens inside Roman marine concrete after it cures. Two things in sequence. First, the seawater dissolves trace elements out of the volcanic ash: aluminum, silicon, magnesium. Those elements precipitate inside the concrete matrix as aluminum tobermorite, a rare crystalline mineral geologists otherwise only find in hydrothermal vents. The tobermorite crystals interlock with each other and with the existing calcium silicate hydrate gel. They strengthen the concrete. Second, over centuries, the seawater continues to react with the lime in the matrix. Phillipsite, a zeolite mineral, grows into every microfracture in the concrete. Phillipsite pulls salt out of the seawater and locks it into the structure. The concrete becomes a carbonate zeolite composite that gets harder and denser every century it stays wet. Modern Portland concrete does the opposite. Chlorides from the saltwater penetrate the matrix, find any embedded steel, and rust it. The Tappan Zee Bridge in New York, opened in 1955, had to be replaced in 2017 because its steel-reinforced piers were dissolving in the Hudson estuary. The replacement is rated for 100 years. Caesarea has done 2,000 and counting. The biggest mistake every homeowner makes is letting a fresh pour dry. Roman concrete needs to stay wet. Cover it with damp burlap and spray it once a day for 28 days, twice a day if it is hot. Modern Portland hits 80% of its final strength in 7 days. Roman concrete hits that strength at 6 months and keeps gaining for another decade. After 28 days, strip the form. The slab should ring like a stone when tapped with a hammer. It should not chalk under your fingernail. If it crumbles, your lime was too old or your pozzolan was unreactive. Break it up, mix the pieces into your next batch and start again. Lime is cheap. Your foundation is not. Number 7. No rebar, and why steel reinforcement was the worst thing that ever happened to concrete. Everything modern construction had built into concrete was about to work against it. If the industry had stopped at gravity-loaded design, this would be a very different story. Instead, in 1854, an English plasterer named William Wilkinson patented the idea of embedding wrought iron bars inside a concrete floor slab. The concept was extended to steel in the 1860s by Joseph Monnier, a French gardener. By 1900, reinforced concrete had taken over civil construction worldwide. Steel rebar has one fatal property: it rusts. The rust occupies up to 7 times the volume of the original steel. That is not a typo, by the way. When water and oxygen reach the bar through hairline cracks, the bar swells, the concrete cracks open further, and the structure fails. The American Society of Civil Engineers, in its 2025 infrastructure report card, estimated that the United States faces more than $3 trillion in unfunded infrastructure repairs by 2033. That is the kind of number that makes accountants cry. The single largest contributor is corroding rebar. The Romans did not put steel in their concrete. They did not need to. Roman concrete was designed for compression loads only. Every major Roman structure was geometrically arranged so that gravity pulled everything into compression. The Pantheon dome works because every stone pushes down on every stone below it. Arches do not need rebar. Compression-only structures do not need anything that can rust. Sometime between 1880 and 1900, the concrete and steel industries made a structural decision. Concrete would be designed as a tensile material with steel doing the tensile work. This unlocked flat slabs, cantilevers, and skyscraper floor plates. It also locked the industry into a 50-year replacement cycle. The rule for anything you build yourself is simple. Compression-only structures get no steel, garden walls, fire pits, foundation footings, fence post bases, chimney pads, root cellar arches. Build them in compression with Roman-style concrete and they will outlast you and your grandchildren. The moment you need a flat slab to span a gap, you are out of Roman territory. That is a steel job, and the rain will eventually eat it. Or redesign around it with an arch instead of a beam, and never replace anything. Each of these 7 techniques solves a problem that modern construction created. Concrete that loses strength in seawater, mixes that crack and stay cracked. Aqueducts that leak in 50 years. Slabs that fall apart because the steel inside them rusts on schedule. The Romans did not solve those problems with magic. They solved them with volcanic ash, quicklime, crushed pottery, basalt rock, and the discipline to keep their paws wet for a month. Every one of those ingredients is sitting in a supply store within 40 miles of your house. The chemistry was published by Vitruvius in 30 BC, confirmed by MIT in 2023, and verified at UC Berkeley and Utah in the decade between. We traded the Roman recipe for assembly line speed and a 50-year replacement cycle. We traded gravity-loaded geometry for steel-loaded beams that the rain will eventually destroy. We traded buildings that stand for 2,000 years for buildings that need to be rebuilt before the people who paid for them retire. The recipe was never ours to lose because it has never been lost.